Imagine you're standing on a sidewalk in a city you know well, watching the flow of pedestrians. There's a man in a blue hoodie walking with a slight tension in his shoulders. He checks his phone, glances at a cafe menu, does the math quickly in his head, and walks on without ordering. He is not in crisis. There is no dramatic hardship visible to the outside observer, but there is a quiet hum of friction running through his day. Every decision, from whether to take a rideshare or wait for the bus, to the way he looks at a shelf in a grocery store, to whether he allows himself to sit down and read for an hour in the evening, is mediated by a silent calculation that never quite turns off. Now imagine that same man a few years later, wearing the same hoodie, walking the same street, but the tension is gone. He still checks prices out of habit, he is still conscious of value, but the mental arithmetic is no longer accompanied by a low-grade background. Anxiety about the balance at the end of the month or the possibility of an unexpected expense derailing everything. The difference between these two versions of the same person is not a matter of financial literacy, nor is it merely the result of a lucky break or an inheritance. It is a threshold, a precise point on the income scale where the nature of money changes from a source of constant cognitive load to a stable background condition that supports rather than consumes psychological resources. And for years, social scientists, behavioral economists, and neuroscientists have been trying to pinpoint exactly where that threshold lies, why it exists, and what happens inside the human mind when it is crossed. In 2010, two researchers from Princeton University, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman and the economist Angus Deaton, published a study that attempted to find this number by analyzing the daily emotional states of nearly 500,000 Americans. They were not asking about long-term life satisfaction or achievements, the kind of retrospective evaluation people make when they look back on their lives and declare themselves generally happy or unhappy. They were asking about the day-to-day emotional quality of life, the actual felt experience of joy, stress, sadness, worry, and contentment as it occurred in real time. What they found was a striking nonlinear relationship between income and emotional well-being. As income rose from poverty toward the middle class, emotional well-being improved rapidly and consistently, but then, somewhere around the upper range of middle-class earnings, the curve flattened in a way that surprised even the researchers. Earning more beyond that point did not produce a measurable increase in day-to-day happiness, meaning that the person earning $150,000 was not, on average, experiencing more moments of joy or fewer moments of sadness than the person earning just above the threshold. The number they landed on, originally around $75,000 in 2010, dollars and adjusted for inflation over the years, has settled around $74,000 a year for a single individual. Below that line, the data showed a clear pattern. Life was characterized by a persistent state of what psychologists now call scarcity bandwidth, a concept that explains why financial stress does not merely feel unpleasant, but actually reduces cognitive capacity, decision-making quality, and the ability to plan for the future. To understand why a specific dollar amount exerts such gravitational pull on human experience, it helps to look at the mechanics of how the brain processes scarcity. When resources feel constrained, whether it is money, time, or even social connection, the mind enters a state of tunneling, a concept developed by the behavioral scientists Sendhil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir in their book, Scarcity: Why Having Too Little Means So Much. Tunneling is exactly what it sounds like. The brain focuses so intensely on the immediate shortage that it loses the ability to see anything outside the narrow beam of attention. This is an adaptation that evolved to handle genuine emergencies like starvation or physical danger, where focusing exclusively on the threat is the correct survival strategy. But, in the modern context, tunneling gets activated by the rent due date, the credit card minimum payment, the car repair that cannot be postponed, the medical bill that arrived unexpectedly. The brain treats these financial stressors with the same neurological urgency it would treat a predator. And as a result, a person earning $40,000 a year is not simply dealing with less money. They are dealing with a constant background process running in their cognitive architecture that consumes executive function, the mental resource responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and complex problem solving. This is why financial stress correlates so strongly with poor decision-making across unrelated domains, not because people become irresponsible or lack discipline, but because the cognitive load of scarcity leaves little room for the kind of deliberate thinking that good decisions require. The bandwidth is simply occupied elsewhere. When income crosses the threshold that Kahneman and Deaton identified, something shifts in this cognitive economy. The constant vigilance around basic needs begins to quiet. The brain stops treating every transaction as a potential threat, and with that cognitive load lifted, a person can engage in what economists call Slack. Slack is the margin of error in any system, the buffer between stability and chaos, the room to absorb a shock without the whole structure collapsing. In financial terms, slack means having enough liquidity that an unexpected expense does not force a trade-off between two other essential needs, like choosing between repairing the car and paying the electric bill. When slack exists, the mind can shift from survival mode to optimization mode. Instead of asking, how do I get through this week, it begins to ask, how do I allocate resources over the next decade to align with my goals? This transition is not merely emotional. Though the emotional relief is significant, it is mathematically consequential, because the ability to think long-term is what allows a person to access the mechanisms of compound growth, to invest in education or skill development, to absorb risk in a way that can lead to higher returns over time, and to avoid the high costs of financial emergencies that often trap people in cycles of debt. There is a subtle irony in this threshold, which is that the psychological benefit of crossing it is largely invisible to the person experiencing it. No alarm sounds, no sudden rush of euphoria arrives. Instead, the absence of stress becomes the new normal, and the person may not realize how much mental energy was previously being consumed by scarcity until they look back years later and recognize that they have stopped having certain kinds of thoughts. This is why wealth perception is often decoupled from absolute income. A person earning $80,000 may feel financially precarious if their expenses have risen in lockstep through lifestyle inflation or if they are carrying significant debt, while a person earning $60,000 with a stable rent-controlled apartment, minimal debt, and a small emergency fund may feel a genuine sense of security. The threshold is not purely about the number on the paycheck. It is about the relationship between that number and the fixed obligations that consume it, and about the presence or absence of slack. What the Princeton study captured was not a magic number that applies to everyone regardless of circumstances, but rather an approximation of the point at which the average person in the average cost of living environment gains enough slack to escape the cognitive tax of scarcity. For some people in expensive cities, the number might be closer to 100,000. For others in lower-cost regions, it might be 60,000. But the underlying principle holds across contexts. There is a point where the marginal utility of an additional dollar shifts from reducing acute stress to funding discretionary desires. And that shift has profound implications for how we think about financial decision-making. This concept has deep implications for how we approach financial education and economic policy. Mainstream financial advice often focuses heavily on micro-behaviors, cutting back on small discretionary expenses like coffee or streaming subscriptions, shopping at discount stores, tracking every expense in a spreadsheet, as if financial stability were primarily a function of individual discipline applied to consumption choices. But behavioral economics suggests that discipline is itself a resource that becomes scarce under financial pressure. Asking someone who is already operating at full cognitive capacity, whose mental bandwidth is already consumed by the constant arithmetic of making ends meet, to exercise even more self-control and to scrutinize every small purchase is like asking a runner to sprint faster while carrying a heavier load. The more effective intervention, both at the individual level and at the systemic level, is to increase slack. For an individual, this might mean focusing energy on increasing income or reducing fixed obligations to create that buffer, rather than obsessing over marginal consumption choices that yield relatively small gains relative to the cognitive cost of tracking them. For a society, it suggests that policies which stabilize housing costs, provide healthcare security, reduce the volatility of income, or create safety nets for unexpected emergencies can have a disproportionate impact on well-being precisely because they reduce the cognitive load of scarcity across the population, freeing up mental bandwidth for the kind of productive activity that drives long-term prosperity. Mathematical mechanics of slack become even more revealing when we look at how the threshold shifts across different life stages and economic contexts. In high-cost urban centers, the number might be significantly higher. In regions with lower housing and transportation costs, it might be lower. But the principle of diminishing returns to emotional well-being after a certain point appears to hold across cultures, with studies in Europe, Asia, and Latin America finding similar nonlinear patterns. What varies is the point at which the curve flattens, which is determined largely by the cost of basic necessities like housing, healthcare, and transportation. This suggests that the threshold is not an intrinsic property of human psychology, but rather a function of the economic environment in which people live. If the cost of housing rises faster than incomes, the threshold rises as well, meaning more people find themselves on the steep part of the curve where additional income directly translates into reduced stress and improved cognitive function. Conversely, when housing is more affordable or when public services reduce the cost of essential needs, the threshold falls, and more people can access the benefits of Slack without needing to reach higher incomes. There is also a fascinating dimension to this conversation that involves the relationship between income and time. One of the hidden costs of being below the threshold is that time becomes a substitute for money in ways that further constrain opportunities. A person without Slack will often spend hours traveling on cheaper but slower transportation, will invest time in repairing things rather than replacing them, will wait in lines for services rather than paying for convenience, and will spend time managing complicated systems of payment plans and assistance programs. All of this time is time that cannot be spent on skill development, on networking, on rest, or on the kind of unstructured creative thinking that often leads to breakthroughs. This is why the scarcity trap is self-reinforcing. Being below the threshold consumes time as well as cognitive bandwidth, which makes it harder to acquire the skills or opportunities that would increase income. Crossing the threshold, even by a modest amount, can free up enough time and mental energy to begin investing in activities that have long-term payoffs, creating a virtuous cycle rather than a vicious one. When we zoom out from the individual to consider the broader economic system, the threshold concept raises important questions about how we measure progress and well-being. Gross domestic product per capita, the standard metric for economic prosperity, tells us nothing about how many people are above or below the threshold, where financial stress stops dominating daily experience. Two countries with the same GDP per capita could have vastly different distributions of Slack, depending on how income is distributed and how the costs of essential goods are structured. This is why measures like the Human Development Index and various well-being indices have gained traction among economists and policymakers, who recognize that aggregate output is a poor proxy for the actual quality of life experienced by individuals. A society that concentrates income at the top while leaving a large portion of its population below the threshold of Slack is a society that is leaving significant human potential unrealized because the cognitive bandwidth of those below the threshold is being consumed by survival rather than contributing to innovation, creativity, and productivity. The historical perspective on this threshold is also revealing. For most of human history, the vast majority of people lived in conditions of material scarcity that would be considered extreme by modern standards, and the concept of a threshold above which financial stress disappears would have applied to only a tiny elite. The post-war period in many developed economies saw a dramatic expansion of the middle class, with rising real wages and falling costs for essentials like housing, education, and healthcare relative to income, which pushed large numbers of people above the threshold for the first time. This period, roughly from the late 1940s to the early 1970s, coincided with a broad increase in emotional well-being, political stability, and social trust, suggesting that the psychological benefits of widespread Slack extend beyond individuals to entire societies. The subsequent decades, characterized by rising inequality, stagnating middle-class wages, and escalating costs for housing and education, have seen a reversal of these trends, with more people falling below the threshold or hovering dangerously close to it, even as aggregate GDP has continued to grow. This brings us to an important distinction that the threshold concept illuminates: the difference between income and wealth, and between flow and stock. The $74,000 figure is about annual income, which is a flow, but the psychological experience of Slack is often more closely tied to wealth, which is a stock. A person with low income but substantial savings or assets can experience Slack because they have a buffer. A person with high income but no savings, living paycheck to paycheck, can experience the same cognitive load as someone earning far less. This is why the threshold is not merely about earning more, but about building enough of a buffer that the income flow is no longer a source of constant vigilance. For many people, crossing the threshold in terms of income is the first step toward building that buffer. But the two are not automatically linked. Lifestyle inflation, the tendency to increase spending as income rises, can keep a person perpetually below the threshold of Slack, even at high income levels, because the fixed obligations expand to consume the additional earnings, leaving no margin for error. The behavioral economics literature on this topic offers a counterintuitive insight. People often misjudge where their own threshold lies. When asked to predict how much money they would need to feel financially secure, people tend to name a number significantly higher than the actual level at which their emotional well-being would plateau. This is partly because humans are poor at effective forecasting. predicting how we will feel in the future. And partly because social comparison drives us to anchor our expectations to what we see around us rather than to our own internal experience. A person earning $50,000 may believe they would feel secure at $80,000, but if they reach $80,000, they may find their expenses have risen and their reference point has shifted to $120,000. The hedonic treadmill, the tendency to adapt to improved circumstances and then desire more, is a well-documented phenomenon, and it operates at the level of material desires just as it does in other domains of pleasure and satisfaction. But the threshold concept suggests that there is a genuine plateau, a point beyond which additional income does not increase day-to-day emotional well-being, even if it does increase material consumption. Recognizing that plateau can help people make more intentional decisions about the trade-off between pursuing higher income and pursuing other sources of fulfillment. As we consider the practical implications of this research, it becomes clear that the goal for most people is not to maximize income, but to reach and maintain a position above the threshold of slack, with enough buffer to protect against the inevitable shocks that life presents. This requires a combination of income management, expense management, and risk management that is often counter to the messages we receive from consumer culture and from financial marketing. The messages we receive tend to emphasize acquisition and consumption, encouraging us to convert income into things that signal status rather than things that provide security. But the evidence from behavioral economics suggests that security, the presence of slack, is a far stronger predictor of emotional well-being than the accumulation of luxury goods or the achievement of status markers. This is not to say that material comforts do not matter. They do, up to the point where basic needs are comfortably met. Beyond that point, the relationship between money and happiness becomes more complex, mediated by how money is used and what psychological needs it is serving. The closing thought here is that the threshold concept invites us to think differently about financial goals. Instead of chasing an ever higher number without a clear understanding of what it will deliver, we can identify our own threshold of slack, the point at which our basic needs are covered, our fixed obligations are manageable, and we have enough buffer to absorb shocks without stress dominating our cognitive landscape. For some, that threshold will be lower than $74,000. For others, it will be higher, depending on circumstances, location, and obligations. But the principle is the same across contexts. Once slack is achieved, the marginal returns to additional income in terms of day-to-day emotional well-being diminish significantly, and the pursuit of more money becomes a choice rather than a necessity. This frees up mental bandwidth to consider other dimensions of a good life. Relationships, meaningful work, learning, rest, and contribution that are often crowded out when financial scarcity dominates attention. The man in the blue hoodie, standing on the sidewalk, checking his phone, glancing at the cafe menu, represents a state of mind that millions of people experience every day. Crossing the threshold does not solve every problem, does not guarantee happiness, does not eliminate the complexity of being human. But it does one thing that makes all the other things possible. It quiets the constant arithmetic in the background, allowing the mind to turn its attention to something else.